In the middle of the 14th century, people ate food. This was true before the plague arrived, and it was true during the plague, and it was true after the plague had passed through a region and moved on to the next one. The eating of food was one of the things that continued with considerable consistency throughout a period that was, in many other respects, somewhat less consistent than people would have preferred. The food itself changed in some ways and did not change in other ways, and the people who ate it thought about it in the ways that people of that period thought about food, which was sometimes practically and sometimes through the lens of the medical theories of the time, which were different from the medical theories of later periods, but which were held with the same degree of conviction and applied with the same degree of seriousness. This is a history of what those people ate. It is not a dramatic history. It is a history of pottage and bread and ale and the occasional salted fish, of the way that onions were chopped and the way that fire was managed and the way that grain was stored in wooden bins in the back rooms of houses that were sometimes visited by plague and sometimes not. It is the kind of history that does not often appear in books, because books tend to prefer the dramatic, and the history of what people ate from day to day is almost never dramatic. It is simply the history of eating, which is a thing that people have always done and will always do, regardless of what else is happening around them. Part 1. The grain. The most important food in 14th century Europe was grain. This was not a matter of preference or of taste. It was simply a matter of necessity, of the organization of agriculture and of the energy requirements of working bodies, and of the difficulty and expense of obtaining any other food in sufficient quantity to form the basis of a diet. Grain was what most people ate most of the time, and the form in which they ate it was primarily bread, though grain also appeared in pottages and in ale and in various other preparations that will be described in due course. The types of grain that were grown and eaten varied by region. In England and in much of northern Europe, the most common grains were wheat, rye, barley and oats. Wheat was generally considered the best grain for making bread, and bread made from wheat flour was whiter and finer in texture and more pleasant to eat by the standards of the period than bread made from other grains. However, wheat was also the most expensive grain, and it required good soil and reasonable weather conditions to produce reliable yields, and so it was not a grain that everyone could afford to eat consistently. Rye was a grain that was hardier than wheat, and could grow in poorer soils and colder conditions, and it was widely grown in regions where wheat did not do well. Bread made from rye was darker than wheat bread, denser in texture, and had a somewhat sour flavour, particularly when the rye had been fermented in the making of the bread. This sourness was not considered a defect, but simply the characteristic flavour of rye bread, which people who ate it regularly became accustomed to and did not find objectionable. Rye bread kept for longer than wheat bread before going stale, which was a practical advantage. Barley was used for several purposes. It could be made into bread, though barley bread was considered inferior to both wheat bread and rye bread, being heavier and less pleasant in texture. Barley was more commonly used for making ale, which will be discussed separately, and also for making pottage, particularly a kind of thick porridge that was made by simmering barley in water for an extended period until the grains softened and the liquid thickened. This barley pottage was a common food, particularly among those who could not afford better, and it was filling and nutritious in a way that was not particularly exciting, but was entirely adequate for keeping a person alive and able to work. Oats were grown primarily in the northern and western parts of Europe, where the climate was cooler and wetter, and wheat did not always do well. In Scotland and in parts of northern England, oats were the primary grain crop, and oat bread and oat porridge were the standard foods. Oat bread was made from a dough that was somewhat wetter and stickier than wheat dough, and which did not rise in the way that leavened wheat bread rose, and so oat bread tended to be flat, cooked on a griddle or a flat stone rather than in an oven. The oat porridge of this region was a simple preparation. Oats simmered in water with a quantity of salt, cooked until thick, eaten from a bowl, sometimes with a small addition of butter or milk if these were available, which they sometimes were and sometimes were not. The milling of grain into flour was done at mills, of which there were several types. The most common were water mills, which used the force of moving water to turn millstones that ground the grain, and windmills, which used the force of wind, and which were a more recent development and not yet present in all regions. There were also hand mills, which were operated by turning a heavy upper stone over a stationary lower stone by means of a handle, which was slow and laborious work and produced a flour that was not as fine as mill-ground flour, but which could be done in the home without the expense of taking grain to a mill. The mill was a central institution in village life, and the miller was an important figure, one who was both necessary and somewhat resented, as millers charged for their services in the form of a portion of the grain being milled, and millers were widely accused in this period of taking more than their fair share, a reputation for dishonesty that attached itself to millers with considerable persistence in the folklore and literature of the time. Whether the average miller was actually more dishonest than the average person in any other occupation is a question that cannot be answered with certainty from the evidence available, but the reputation was firmly established and was reflected in numerous proverbs, stories, and legal regulations that attempted to constrain what millers could charge. Once the grain was milled into flour, the flour was used to make bread. The making of bread was done in households where women were typically responsible for this work, though professional bakers also existed in towns, and the bread sold by professional bakers was subject to regulation. In England there was a law called the Assize of Bread, which specified the weight and price of bread depending on the current price of grain. This law had been in existence for more than a century by the time the plague arrived, and it was enforced by local officials called alletasters and bread tasters, who periodically check the weight and quality of bread sold by bakers and fined those who were found to be selling bread that was underweight or otherwise deficient. The process of making bread began with the flour, to which water was added, and the mixture worked together until it formed a dough. If the bread was to be leavened, which was the case for the finer sorts of wheat bread, some quantity of yeast was added to the dough. The yeast might come from ale that was in the process of fermenting, as ale making produced a froth of yeast that could be skimmed off and added to bread dough to make it rise. The bread dough then needed to rest for a period of time, during which the yeast acted upon the sugars in the flour and produced small bubbles of gas that made the dough expand. This process was understood in practical terms, though the specific mechanisms were not understood in the way they would come to be understood in later centuries. After resting and rising, the dough was formed into loaves and baked. Baking was done in ovens where the technology permitted, or on the hearth where it did not. The large communal ovens of villages and towns were heated by burning wood inside them until the interior reached a sufficient temperature, at which point the burning wood was raked out and the loaves were slid in on long flat shovels, and the oven was sealed and the bread baked in the heat that the oven had absorbed. The timing of baking was judged by experience, as there was no precise way to measure oven temperature, and the skill of the baker lay in knowing how long the oven needed to heat, how long the bread needed to bake, and when it was done. The resulting bread was, by the standards of what is available today, a simple and rather substantial food. The finest wheat bread, made from sifted flour from which most the bran had been removed, was called manchet or similar names in different regions, and was white and relatively light, and was the bread eaten by the wealthy. The bread eaten by most people was made from less refined flour that contained more bran and was therefore darker and denser and more filling per loaf, and also somewhat more nutritious from the perspective of modern nutritional science, though this was not how it was understood at the time, when whiteness of bread was associated with refinement and quality. There was also a very coarse bread, made from the cheapest flour or from grains other than wheat, sometimes mixed with peas or beans or other materials to extend the flour, which was eaten by the poorest people. This bread was dark, heavy, and dense, and not pleasant by the standards of those who had access to better, but it was filling, and it kept a working person alive and able to function, which was its primary purpose. Bread served purposes beyond simply being eaten. It was also used as a plate of a sort. A thick slice of stale bread, called a trencher, was placed on the table and food was placed upon it, and the trencher absorbed the juices and sauces of the food placed on it, and at the end of the meal the trencher was either eaten by the person who had used it, or given to servants or to the poor. This practice was common at all levels of society, from the noble household down to the modest farmhouse, though the quality of the trencher bread naturally varied. Part 2. The pottage. If bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, pottage was its most universal companion. Pottage was a term that covered a very wide range of preparations, from a thin soup of water and a few vegetables to a thick, substantial stew of meat and grains, and vegetables that was more or less indistinguishable from what would today be called a stew or a porridge. The common element was that the food was cooked in liquid, usually water, sometimes with added fat, or with the liquid that resulted from boiling meat, which would be called stock in later culinary language, and the result was eaten from a bowl with a spoon, or, where there was no spoon available, with a piece of bread that was torn off and used to scoop the food. Pottage was practical. It required only a pot and a fire and some ingredients and time. It could be started in the morning and left to cook slowly over the fire while the household went about its other business, which was an important advantage in a period when people's time was largely consumed by the physical labour of farming and domestic work. A pot of pottage could simmer for hours without requiring constant attention, and during this time the ingredients would slowly soften and meld, and the liquid would thicken, and the result would be ready when the household returned, or when the working day reached the point where eating was necessary. The ingredients that went into pottage depended on what was available, which depended on the season, the region, the weather of the year in question, the prosperity of the household, and various other factors. In a prosperous household, pottage might contain meat, pieces of pork or beef or mutton cooked until tender, which flavoured the liquid and provided a substantial and nourishing component to the dish. In a less prosperous household, meat might be present only as a bone that had been boiled for its flavour, and the small amount of marrow it contained, or might be absent entirely, and the pottage would be made primarily from vegetables and grains. The vegetables most commonly used in pottage were those that were available and affordable. Onions were among the most universally used vegetables of the medieval period, and they appeared in pottage with great regularity. Onions were grown in gardens and were not expensive, and they added flavour to dishes in a way that made otherwise plain food more palatable. They were chopped and added to the pottage raw, to soften in the cooking liquid, or they were fried in fat first, which developed their sweetness and added a different quality to the dish. Leeks were similarly common, and were used in much the same way as onions, having a milder and more subtle flavour. Leeks were grown in gardens and in fields, and they were available through much of the year, remaining in the ground through winter in many regions and providing fresh green food at times when other vegetables were not available. A pottage of leeks with a small amount of barley or oats was a simple and common dish, made from ingredients that were widely available and not expensive. Peas and beans were important ingredients in pottage, as they provided protein in a diet that often lacked sufficient quantities of it. Dried peas and beans could be stored through the winter, and were available throughout the year, though they required extended soaking and cooking to become tender. A pottage of dried peas, simmered until soft and then partially mashed into the cooking liquid to thicken it, was a common and filling dish. The flavour of such a pottage was mild, somewhat earthy, and not particularly exciting, but it was substantial and filling and provided nourishment that kept people fed through the long months between harvests. Cabbage and other leafy vegetables were used when available. Cabbage was a hardy crop that could survive cold weather, and it was one of the more reliably available vegetables through the autumn and early winter. It was chopped and added to pottage, where it softened in the cooking and added a mildly bitter, vegetable flavour to the dish. Other vegetables that appeared in pottage included turnips, parsnips, carrots, and various other root vegetables, all of which were chopped into pieces and cooked until soft in the simmering liquid. Herbs were added to pottage for flavour and also, in the understanding of the time, for their medicinal properties. The boundary between food and medicine was not sharply defined in medieval thinking, and many plants were understood to have effects on the body that went beyond simple nourishment. Common culinary herbs such as parsley, thyme, sage, and savoury were grown in gardens and were added to pottage and other dishes for flavour. More specialised herbs with more specific medicinal reputations were also used, though their addition to food was governed more by ideas about their effects on the body than by their contribution to the flavour of the dish. During the period of the Black Death, the herbs and spices added to food took on an additional significance in the thinking of the time. Medical theories of the 14th century understood disease in terms of the balance of four humours in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The plague, in this understanding, was associated with a corruption of the air and with disturbances in the humoral balance, and various foods and spices were believed to either protect against or promote the conditions that made plague worse. Foods that were warm and dry in their qualities were thought to be beneficial, while those that were cold and moist were thought to be dangerous. This theory influenced what people chose to eat and what they avoided, though the actual effects of these dietary choices on their susceptibility to plague were of course negligible. Spices that were warm in their supposed qualities included ginger, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, and these were recommended by physicians as protective against the plague, to the extent that those who could afford them consumed them with perhaps more enthusiasm than usual during times of epidemic. Vinegar was another substance that was recommended, both as a cleaning agent and as an addition to food, on the grounds that its sharpness would counteract the corrupting quality of the air that was believed to cause the disease. People added vinegar to their food and drink and sometimes washed surfaces and even themselves with it, though again, the actual protective effects were not what the theory suggested. The pottage of a wealthy household during this period might therefore contain a notable quantity of spices. Ginger added in powdered form, pepper ground from peppercorns, a small amount of cinnamon or ginger root. These additions would have made the pottage more flavourful, and would also have served as a demonstration of wealth, since spices were expensive and not accessible to ordinary people. The physician to a noble household might also have recommended that the household drink its pottage from vessels of silver, since silver was thought to have purifying properties, or that the pottage be made with water that had been passed through silver vessels, or that certain precious stones be placed in the cooking pot, though these recommendations are perhaps more interesting as historical curiosities than as practical guides to plague prevention. The pottage of a poor household during the same period was simpler in every way. No spices, no silver vessels, no precious stones. Perhaps a pottage of dried peas with some chopped onion and a quantity of salt and enough water to make a consistent liquid, simmered for several hours over a fire that was maintained from the banked coals of the previous night. The result was a thick, dull-coloured, mildly flavoured preparation that was eaten because it was what was available, and it served its purpose as food in the basic sense of providing calories and some nutrition, even if it provided little in the way of pleasure. Part 3. The Ale. In 14th century England, most people drank ale most of the time. This is not because 14th century people were more inclined to drunkenness than people of other periods, though opinions on this matter have varied. It is because ale was the safe and practical drink of the period, while water was not reliably safe, being subject to contamination from various sources including animal waste, human waste, and decomposing organic matter, and being therefore a source of illness in a period when waterborne diseases were common, and when there was no practical method of purifying water beyond the natural purification that occurred in clear-running streams from clean sources. Ale was made from grain, primarily barley, through a process of malting and brewing that produced a liquid that was mildly alcoholic, nutritious, and stable enough to be kept for a few days without spoiling. The alcohol content of medieval ale was lower than that of most modern beers, and the effect of drinking the quantities of ale that were consumed regularly was not dramatic intoxication, but rather a mild background effect that was accepted as normal. Ale was drunk by people of all ages, including children, though the quantity given to children was often smaller than that given to adults, and sometimes it was diluted further with water. The making of ale was primarily a domestic activity, carried out by women who were known as alewives. The alewife of a household might also sell ale to neighbours and to travellers, supplementing the household income in a way that was organised and regulated by the same kind of official oversight that regulated the baking of bread. The assize of ale, like the assize of bread, specified the price at which ale was to be sold depending on the current price of grain, and ale-tasters periodically tested ale for quality and correct measure. To make ale, barley grain was first malted. Malting involved soaking the grain in water until it began to germinate, at which point the grain was dried, killing the germinating plant but preserving the enzymes that it had begun to produce, which were necessary for converting the grain starch into sugars that yeast could ferment. The dried malted grain was then crushed and mixed with hot water in a process called mashing, which activated the enzymes and produced a sweet liquid called wort. The wort was then cooled and yeast was added, and the fermentation process began, consuming the sugars and producing alcohol and the bubbles of carbon dioxide that were visible in the fermenting liquid. The resulting ale was not filtered in any precise modern sense. It contained a degree of cloudiness from the yeast and other particles, and it had a flavour that was somewhat different from modern ales, being less bitter, since hops, which are the plant material responsible for much of the bitterness in modern beer, were not widely used in English ale until somewhat later in the period. Herbs other than hops, collectively known as gruit, were sometimes added to ale for flavour and for the preservative effect that some of them provided, but ale made without any herb additions was also common, and its flavour was primarily malty and somewhat sweet, with a yeasty undertone. During the plague period, ale consumption continued more or less as normal. Some medical advice of the period cautioned against drinking excessively, as excess of any kind was thought to weaken the body's resistance to disease. But the alternative of drinking water was considered by those who thought about it medically to be at least as dangerous as moderate ale consumption, and so the practical advice was to continue drinking ale in reasonable quantities. This advice, for once, was not without some rational basis, as the brewing process did kill many of the pathogens that might have been present in the water used in brewing. Wine was also consumed in 14th century England, though primarily by those who were wealthy enough to afford it. Wine was imported from France, primarily from the Bordeaux region, and from other wine-producing areas, and it was a luxury good that demonstrated the social status of those who drank it. The medical view of wine was complex. It was considered warm and strengthening in moderate quantities, but dangerous in excess, and the specific qualities of different wines were analysed in considerable detail in the medical literature of the period. During the plague, wine was recommended in some medical texts as protective or strengthening, and those who could afford it may have consumed it in larger quantities than usual, following such advice. Whether this improved their health or worsened, it depended on the quantity consumed, and it is unlikely that it had any specific effect on their susceptibility to plague, which was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and was not influenced by the consumption of wine in any direct way. Part 4. The meat was a part of the diet of most people in 14th century Europe, though the quantity and type of meat consumed varied enormously depending on social status. the time of year, and the proximity to sources of supply. The wealthy ate meat daily and in substantial quantities, and their meat was varied. Beef, mutton, pork, veal, venison, game birds, and the flesh of various other animals appeared at the tables of the nobility and the prosperous clergy. The poor ate meat much less frequently, and when they did, it was typically the cheaper cuts and the preserved forms, primarily salt pork and dried or smoked fish, rather than fresh meat. Pork was the most universally available meat for people of middling and lower status. The keeping of a pig was within the means of many households, as pigs could be fed on kitchen scraps and on foraging in woodland, and a single pig, slaughtered in the autumn when the weather turned cold, provided a substantial quantity of food that could be preserved through the winter by salting, smoking, and drying. The various parts of the pig were used in different ways. The fatty belly meat was salted and dried to make bacon. The legs were preserved whole as hams. The intestines were cleaned and stuffed with offal and fat and seasoning to make sausages. The feet and ears and snout were pickled or boiled. The blood was mixed with grain and fat and cooked to make a kind of sausage, and the fat was rendered and kept for cooking. The autumn pig slaughter was therefore an important event in the household calendar, a moment of significant food production that required the coordinated effort of the household and sometimes of neighbours, and that resulted in the filling of the salting trough and the smokehouse and the sausage casings with food that would sustain the household through the months when fresh food was not available. This event was marked by some festivity in many traditions, the slaughter itself being unpleasant, but the abundance of fresh meat that followed being a welcome change from the more monotonous diet of preserved and stored food. Sheep were kept primarily for wool, which was a valuable agricultural product, and secondarily for their milk, from which cheese was made, and the sheep themselves were eaten when they were old and no longer productive for these primary purposes. Mutton, the meat of old sheep, was consequently a common food, though it was tougher and stronger in flavour than the meat of younger animals. The preparation of mutton required extended cooking to make it tender, which was achieved by long, slow simmering in pottage, which the tough fibres of the meat responded to by gradually breaking down and becoming edible. Cattle were similarly kept for purposes other than their meat, for their milk and for their labour in ploughing and hauling, and they too were eaten when their productive lives were over. Beef from old working cattle was also tough and required long cooking, and it was preserved by salting in the same way as pork. The hides of slaughtered cattle were an important material for leather, and the bones were used for various purposes, including the making of tools and small objects, and the fat was used for cooking and for making candles and for waterproofing leather, so that relatively little of a slaughtered animal was wasted. The church had a significant influence on what people ate, particularly in relation to meat. The church calendar prescribed a large number of fast days throughout the year on which the eating of meat and certain other animal products was forbidden. Fridays were always fast days, commemorating the day of the crucifixion, and Saturdays were also sometimes treated as fast days in different regional traditions. The 40 days of Lent before Easter were a period of particularly strict fasting, during which meat was forbidden entirely, and even dairy products were sometimes restricted. There were also fast days associated with other major religious feasts throughout the year. On these fast days, people ate fish. Fish was therefore the alternative to meat that the church's calendar made necessary, and the supply of fish was an important aspect of the medieval food economy. Salt fish, primarily herring and cod, was the most widely available and affordable form of fish, as it could be preserved almost indefinitely by heavy salting and could be transported long distances. Herring was caught in enormous quantities in the North Sea and Baltic, and preserved by salting and sometimes by smoking, and it was distributed through a network of trade that brought it to inland regions far from any sea. The eating of salted herring on fast days was a near universal experience for people throughout England and Northern Europe. Salted herring was soaked in water before cooking to remove some of the salt, though the soaking was never entirely effective, and salted fish retained a degree of saltiness even after extended soaking that contributed to a persistent thirst, which was in turn satisfied with more ale, which was the drink available. The herring were then cooked in various ways: boiled, fried in fat, baked, or added to pottage. No preparation could make salt herring into an exciting food, and it was eaten primarily because eating it was required, and because it was what was available, not because it was particularly pleasurable. During the plague period, the fast day requirement continued in force, at least officially, though there is evidence that in severely affected areas the strict observation of fasting rules was sometimes relaxed by local religious authorities as a matter of practical necessity. Where the population had been dramatically reduced by the plague, where the economic organization that produced and distributed food had been disrupted, and where the normal routines of village and town life had been disturbed by the deaths of large numbers of people, the precise observation of which foods were permitted on which days was perhaps a lower priority than simply finding enough food to eat. Part 5. The Vegetables and the Garden. The medieval household typically had a garden, or at least access to a garden, and the garden was an important source of food throughout the year. The contents of the garden were not organized by aesthetics in the way that many modern gardens are, but by utility. What could be grown and eaten? What could be grown and used for medicine? And what could be grown and used for other practical purposes, such as dyeing cloth or making rope? The kitchen garden of a typical household of middling status would have contained a range of vegetables and herbs. Onions and leeks, already mentioned as important ingredients in pottage, were grown in quantity. So were garlic, which was used for flavouring food and which was also believed to have protective properties against disease. Beliefs that in some sense anticipated the modern knowledge of garlic's mild antimicrobial properties, though for different reasons and on the basis of different theoretical frameworks. Cabbages and their relatives were grown, including kale, a hardy leafy vegetable that could survive considerable cold and was one of the vegetables available through the winter months. Parsnips, turnips and beets were grown and used both as food for people and, in harder times, as food for animals. Beans of various types were grown and dried for winter use. Peas were grown both for fresh eating in summer and for drying for winter use. Herbs were an important part of the garden. Parsley, which was perhaps the most universally used culinary herb. Sage, which was used both for cooking and for medicine, and which was believed to have particularly beneficial properties for the aged and infirm. Mint, which was used to flavour various preparations and was believed to aid digestion. Thyme, which was used in cooking and had a reputation for strengthening the heart, and rosemary, which was an aromatic herb used in cooking and medicine, and which also had a ceremonial role in various contexts, including funerals, where it was carried and placed on coffins as a symbol of remembrance. During the plague, certain herbs and plants were particularly valued for their supposed protective properties. Rue was thought to be a specific against the plague, and people wore bunches of rue about their persons or kept it in their houses, and it was used in various preparations intended to protect against infection. The strong smell of rue was thought to counteract the corrupted air that was believed to carry the disease. Wormwood was similarly used. Strong-smelling plants generally were believed to be protective, on the principle that a powerful good smell would counteract a powerful bad smell, and that it was the bad smell, or miasma, that carried disease. Vinegar, which has already been mentioned in connection with food, was used extensively during the plague as a kind of sanitizing agent. Herbs were steeped in vinegar to make preparations that were taken internally or applied to the skin or used to clean surfaces. The recipe that came to be known in later tradition as Four Thieves Vinegar, a preparation of vinegar with various herbs including garlic, rosemary, lavender, and others, which was supposedly used by thieves who robbed the bodies of plague victims without themselves being infected, is perhaps apocryphal in its specific narrative, but reflects the genuine use of herb-infused vinegar as a protective preparation during plague epidemics. The garden also provided fruit in season. Apple trees and pear trees were common in gardens of all but the smallest and poorest households, and they provided fruit in the autumn that could be eaten fresh, dried for winter storage, or made into various preserved preparations. Plums and cherries were grown in some regions. Soft fruits such as strawberries, raspberries, and various other wild and cultivated berries were gathered and eaten in season, though they were not a staple food, but rather a seasonal supplement to the diet. Fruit was viewed with some suspicion by medieval medical thinking, which held that raw fruit was cold and moist in its qualities, and therefore potentially harmful, particularly for people who were already unwell or who were constitutionally inclined toward coldness and moisture. During the plague, this suspicion of raw fruit was likely intensified, as physicians and others who thought about such matters would have urged people to avoid the cold and moist foods that were thought to predispose the body to the humoral imbalances associated with the disease. Whether this advice had any effect on the amount of fruit people actually ate is difficult to say. People who had access to fruit and were hungry probably ate it regardless of what the physicians advised. Part 6. The dairy milk and the products made from milk were an important part of the medieval diet, though the availability of fresh milk was more limited than it is in modern times, being dependent on the presence of a milking animal, and fresh milk was not preserved in the way that modern refrigeration allows. The animals kept for milk in the medieval period were primarily cows, goats, and sheep, and the use of their milk varied by region and by the traditions associated with each animal. Cow's milk was the most abundant and widely used in England. Dairy cattle of the period were not the specialized high-yielding breeds of modern dairy farming, but rather animals of mixed purpose that produced milk in addition to their other functions of providing labor and eventually meat. Their milk yield was much lower than modern dairy cattle, and the milk itself was richer in fat, which made it suitable for the making of butter and cream. Butter butter was made by churning cream or whole milk until the fat particles clumped together and separated from the liquid, which was called buttermilk. The butter was then salted for preservation, as fresh butter spoiled quickly without salt in a time before refrigeration. Salted butter kept for considerably longer than fresh, and it was used in cooking, for frying, for enriching pottage, for spreading on bread when it was available, and was also an item of trade and taxation in regions where it was produced in quantity. Cheese was perhaps the most important form in which dairy was preserved and consumed. The making of cheese involved curdling milk, usually by the addition of rennet, which is an enzyme obtained from the stomach lining of young ruminants, and which causes the proteins in milk to coagulate and separate from the liquid
whey. The curds were then pressed and salted and aged, and the result was cheese of various types, ranging from fresh, soft cheeses that were eaten soon after making to hard-aged cheeses that could be kept for months. The cheese of the 14th century was not the diverse and carefully distinguished world of cheese that exists in France or other modern cheese-producing regions, but it was varied in the way that cheese made by hand under different conditions inevitably is. Hard-aged cheese, which was the form that kept best and was most easily transported and traded, was an important food for working people, being nourishing, portable, and keeping without spoiling in a way that most other foods did not. A piece of hard cheese and a lump of bread was the typical food of a working man taking his midday meal in the field, and this combination was nourishing enough to sustain the physical work of farming for the afternoon. During the plague period, dairy products continued to be produced and consumed, though the disruption of labour by disease inevitably affected the management of livestock. Milking is a daily task that cannot be postponed. A cow that is not milked regularly will stop producing milk and will suffer physical discomfort. When the people who normally milked the cattle died or fled, the cattle suffered and milk production declined, and this contributed to the general reduction in food supply that accompanied severe outbreaks of the plague. The medical advice of the period regarding dairy was mixed. Milk was considered cold and moist, which put it in the category of foods that were thought to be potentially harmful during the plague, and some medical texts advised moderation or avoidance. Cheese was considered somewhat better, particularly aged hard cheese, which was thought to be drier and therefore less predisposing to the humoral conditions associated with disease. These recommendations were made by learned physicians primarily for the benefit of their wealthy clients, who could afford to follow such advice and to substitute preferred foods for those they were advised to avoid, and had less relevance to poor people who ate what was available, regardless of its supposed humoral qualities. Part 7. The spices. Spices were an important part of medieval cooking, at least for those who could afford them, and the spice trade was a significant element of the medieval economy, bringing goods from distant regions of Asia and Africa through complex networks of trade to the markets of European cities. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cardamom, saffron, and many other substances were bought and sold by merchants who specialized in spices, and they appeared in the cooking of wealthy households in quantities and combinations that seem remarkable by the standards of later periods when spice use declined and became more restrained. Pepper was the most widely traded and most commonly used spice. It came from the pepper plant, which grew in the tropical regions of southern and southeastern Asia,
primarily in what is now India and Indonesia, and it was traded through the Arab world and through Byzantine and later Italian merchant intermediaries to the markets of northern Europe. The price of pepper reflected this long journey and the hands through which it passed, and it was expensive enough to be a significant luxury for ordinary people, though not so expensive that the modestly prosperous could not occasionally afford a small quantity. Cinnamon came from the bark of trees growing in Sri Lanka and other tropical regions, and was imported in the form of curled dried bark sticks or ground powder. It was used in both sweet and savoury preparations, as the distinction between sweet and savoury cooking was not as sharply made in the 14th century as it came to be in later periods. A meat dish might contain cinnamon and sugar alongside onions and broth, the combination of flavours that modern taste would find strange being entirely normal and desirable as the cooking of this period. Ginger was imported from southern Asia in dried and powdered form, or sometimes as a preserved root candied in sugar. It was valued both for its flavour and for its warming qualities, which made it particularly desirable from the medical perspective that saw warm spices as beneficial and protective. Ginger appeared in a very wide range of medieval preparations, in pottage, in sauces, in sweet pastries and confections, and in spiced wine and ale. During the plague period, the demand for warming spices increased among those who could afford them, as medical advice emphasized the protective properties of warm and dry foods. This increased demand may have contributed to higher prices for spices during the worst years of the epidemic, though the disruption of trade by the plague itself, which killed merchants and disrupted the networks of people who moved goods from one region to another, probably complicated the supply chains in ways that are difficult to trace precisely. For ordinary people who could not afford imported spices, the flavour that spices provided was sought from locally produced alternatives. Mustard seeds, which could be grown in the garden, were ground to make a pungent paste or dried powder that added sharpness to food. Horseradish was another locally available source of pungency. Various herbs provided aromatic flavours that, while different from the exotic spices, served some of the same culinary and medical purposes in the understanding of the time. Part 8. The Rich and the Poor. The diet described above was not a single diet, but many different diets, distinguished primarily by wealth and social status. What a lord or wealthy merchant ate in the 14th century was different in kind, not merely in quantity, from what a villager or labourer ate, and this difference was not simply one of having more or less of the same things, but of having access to entirely different categories of food. A wealthy household of the period ate fresh meat regularly, including the reserved and prestigious meats of venison and game that were legally restricted to the upper classes through the forest laws that protected the hunting rights of the nobility. Fresh fish, including the most prized species such as pike, salmon, and lamprey, appeared at wealthy tables. Fine white bread made from sifted wheat flour was eaten. Imported spices were used in cooking and appeared in quantities that reflected both their flavour and their cost. Wine, both domestic and imported, was drunk. Sugar, which was imported and expensive, was used in cooking and in confections. The number of separate dishes served at a wealthy meal was large, and the arrangement of the meal into multiple courses was an elaborate ritual that reflected the social organization of the household.
A poor household ate a quite different range of food. Dark bread made from mixed grains or from grain mixed with peas or beans. Pottage made from dried legumes and whatever vegetables the garden provided. Salt fish on fast days and perhaps occasionally salt pork from the household's pig. Ale brewed at home. Dairy products when the household had access to a milking animal. No imported spices, or perhaps a very small quantity of the cheapest available on rare occasions. No wine. No sugar except perhaps honey in very small amounts from the household's bees. Between these extremes were their many gradations of middling life, the craftsman's household, the prosperous farmer, the small merchant, the minor churchman, each eating something that fell somewhere on the spectrum between the abundance of the wealthy and the scarcity of the poor, eating some fine things and some coarse things, having some days of relative variety and abundance, and other days of monotony and near sufficiency, managing their food supplies through the year with the constant awareness that what was stored needed to last until the next harvest. The Black Death cut across all of these levels of society. It killed the wealthy and the poor, the well-nourished and the malnourished, the lord in his castle and the villager in his one-room cottage. Though it may have killed some social groups at higher rates than others, these differences were not sufficient to protect any class from the disease, which was caused by a bacterium that was not interested in the social hierarchy of its hosts. However, the consequences of the plague were experienced differently across social levels in relation to food. The wealthy had reserves of food, stored grain, and preserved meats, and wine that could sustain them through periods when the normal supply chains were disrupted. Poor people had no such reserves and were immediately vulnerable when the plague disrupted the systems of production and distribution that their daily survival depended upon. A labourer who was too ill to work could not earn the food he needed. A village depleted of working adults could not bring in the harvest, and the grain that had been growing in the fields simply stood unharvested as the autumn advanced, rotting in the wet or being eaten by birds. In some regions, the shortage of labour following the plague actually improved the conditions of the surviving poor, who found that their labour was suddenly in greater demand, and that they could negotiate for better wages and better conditions than had been available before. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351, passed in response to this labour shortage, attempted to fix wages and prices at pre-plague levels, and to prevent the labouring poor from taking advantage of their improved bargaining position. This statute was widely evaded and largely unsuccessful, and in the decades following the plague the conditions of the English labouring poor did generally improve, which eventually expressed itself in improved diet. But this improvement came gradually and unevenly, and the immediate aftermath of the plague was not a time of improvement for anyone. The disruption of agriculture, the deaths of so many who had tended the animals and grown the crops and ground the grain and baked the bread, the collapse in some regions of the institutional structures that organized and distributed food, all contributed to food shortages that affected even those who had survived the disease itself. Part 9. The preservation of food. The preservation of food was a critical technology in the 14th century, as it is in any period before refrigeration, and the methods available were those that had been developed over many centuries of practical necessity. Salt was the most important preservative, used for preserving meat, fish, vegetables, and dairy products. Smoking was used to preserve meat in fish, adding a degree of preservation on top of or in combination with salting. Drying was used for fish, fruit, vegetables, and grain. Pickling in vinegar or brine was used for vegetables and sometimes for meat. Storing in fat, particularly lard, was used for certain preparations such as confit of poultry. Salt was a valuable commodity, traded extensively and controlled in some regions through taxation and monopoly arrangements. The production of salt was concentrated in regions with access to the sea or to salt springs, where salt water could be evaporated to leave crystals of salt, and this salt was then distributed inland through networks of trade. The price of salt varied by region and distance from production, being relatively cheap near the coasts and more expensive inland, and the ability to afford sufficient salt for preserving the household's food supply was a significant economic consideration for many families. The salting of meat was done in autumn, when animals were slaughtered before the winter, because feed was insufficient to maintain the full herd or flock through the cold months. The meat was rubbed thoroughly with salt or packed in salt in wooden tubs or barrels, and the salt drew moisture out of the meat and preserved it against spoilage. The resulting salt meat was very salty, requiring soaking before cooking to reduce the salt content to palatable levels, and it did not taste exactly like fresh meat, but it was nourishing, and it kept the household fed through the winter. Salted herring was processed in enormous quantities at the fishing grounds of the North Sea and Baltic Sea, where autumn herring runs produced catches that were immediately salted in barrels on the boats or at the shore and then transported by ship and wagon to markets throughout northern Europe. The organization of this trade was a significant commercial enterprise, and the herring fairs held at various points along the coast and at inland market towns were major events in the annual economic calendar. The drying of grain was achieved simply by storing it in dry conditions, in barns or granaries with good ventilation, where the grain could lose moisture and remain stable for months or years. Properly dried and stored grain could last several years without significant deterioration, which made it possible for a prosperous household or an institution such as a monastery or a lord's estate to accumulate grain reserves that could sustain the household through poor harvests. This capacity for storing grain was one of the advantages that wealthy institutions had over poor individuals, who had no surplus to store and who lived close to the margin of
subsistence in normal times. The drying of fruit was done in ovens or in the sun, and the resulting dried fruit, apples, pears, plums, cherries, provided a sweet supplement to the winter diet, and could be added to pottage or eaten as they were. The making of fruit preserves, cooked with honey to form a thick, stable preparation, was known and practiced, though honey was expensive enough that such preparations were something of a luxury. Part 10. The monasteries and convents were significant producers and consumers of food in medieval Europe, and their food practices are somewhat better documented than those of ordinary households, because monasteries kept records, and because the regulation of what monks and nuns ate was a matter of religious rule that was codified and discussed in writing. The rule of St. Benedict, which governed the practice of Benedictine monasteries, specified the general principles of the monastic diet. 2 cooked dishes at the main meal, with bread and a measure of wine, and more on days when the community was doing heavy physical labour. Meat was restricted. The rule specified that the flesh of four-footed animals should not be eaten except by the sick and the very weak, though in practice this restriction was variously interpreted and observed over the centuries, and many monasteries regularly ate meat in ways that the strict letter of the rule might not have sanctioned. Fish was abundant in the monastic diet, not only because of the fast day requirements that applied to all Christians, but also because many monasteries maintained fish ponds, which were artificial ponds stocked with fish, primarily carp and pike and bream and tench, that could be harvested as needed. These fish ponds were a valuable resource and required management, maintaining the water level, keeping out predators, feeding the fish if necessary, and harvesting them at appropriate times. The fish from these ponds provided fresh fish throughout the year, which was an advantage over ordinary households that might have access only to salt fish for most of the year. Monasteries also typically had substantial gardens, which provided vegetables and herbs. The monastery garden was managed by the gardener, who was a monk or a lay brother assigned to this task, and it was expected to provide a significant portion of the community's vegetable needs. The herb garden of the monastery had both culinary and medicinal functions, as monasteries provided medical care to the community and maintained an infirmary where sick people were treated. The monastic kitchen was a significant operation, providing food for a community that might range from a few dozen to several hundred people, depending on the size of the monastery. The kitchen was staffed by monks or lay brothers who were assigned to this work, and the work was continuous. Bread to be baked, pottage to be prepared, fish to be cooked, and all of it to be ready at the times prescribed by the monastic schedule, which divided the day into specific periods of prayer, work, and eating, with no flexibility for late meals. When the plague struck, monasteries were particularly vulnerable because the close living conditions of a monastic community, with many people sharing dormitories, eating halls, and work spaces, facilitated the transmission of disease within the community. The mortality among clergy and religious during the plague was very high, with some monasteries losing the majority of their members within a few months. The records of some English monasteries show that communities of 40 or 50 monks were reduced to 10 or fewer, and the disruption to the institutional life of the monastery, including the production and provision of food, was enormous. Where monasteries survived the initial devastation, they often took in survivors and provided food and care to those who had lost their household support systems. The traditional monastic practice of providing hospitality to travellers and alms to the poor was tested severely in the plague period, as the numbers of people seeking help increased while the monastic communities themselves were diminished. Part 11. The feast and the fast medieval life was organised around a rhythm of feast and fast that structured the year in a way that was simultaneously religious, social and agricultural. The feast days of the church calendar were occasions for special food, including foods that were normally not eaten: roast meat, fine white bread, sweet preparations made with honey or imported sugar, wine, and various confections and pastries. The fast days, which were more numerous than the feast days, were occasions for the abstinence from meat and the eating of fish and vegetables. This rhythm meant that the experience of food was not a monotonous sameness throughout the year, but a variation between abundance and restriction, between the festivity of the feast and the plainness of the fast.
and this variation gave food a significance in the social and religious life of the period that went beyond simple nourishment. The great feasts of the year were Christmas, Easter, and the feast days of the most important saints. At Christmas, the great household celebrated with elaborate meals that went on for many hours and included many courses: roasted meats, game birds, fish preparations, pastries and pies, sweet dishes made with spices and dried fruit, wine and ale. The servants and lower members of the household were also fed well at these times, as the provision of feast food to dependents and servants was part of the obligation of a wealthy household toward those who depended on it. At Easter, the end of the Lenten fast was celebrated with the foods that had been forbidden for 40 days: meat, eggs, dairy. The first meal after Lent that included these foods was a moment of particular pleasure, the pleasure of food being heightened by the preceding period of abstinence in the way that enjoyment of anything is heightened by its previous absence. During the plague years, the observance of feast days and fast days continued, more or less, as a matter of religious obligation and social habit, even as the communities that observed them were devastated by disease. The celebrations were diminished by the absence of the dead, by the disruption of normal social and commercial life, by the fear and grief that accompanied the epidemic. But the calendar of the Church continued, and the days it prescribed as feast days or fast days remained what they were. There are accounts from the plague years of a kind of desperate festivity among some of the survivors, a sense that since death was so close and so certain, the pleasures of eating and drinking might as well be enjoyed while the opportunity existed. This is the response to plague that appears in accounts such as Boccaccio's Decameron, where the plague in Florence is described as leading some people to eat and drink freely and abandon a normal restraint. Whether this was a widespread response or a response of a particular social group, or whether it was somewhat exaggerated in the literary accounts, is difficult to say. Certainly the normal restraints and social obligations associated with food and eating were disrupted in various ways, and the absence of many of the people who normally enforced those restraints, the lord whose household had a feast day tradition, the priest whose parish observed the fast day rules, the mother whose household kept the regular rhythms of daily food, must have changed the experience of eating in significant ways. Part 12. The Aftermath. When the first great wave of the Black Death had passed through a region, the landscape of food production was changed. Fields that had been cultivated were untended. Animals that had been cared for wandered without care. Mills that had ground grain stood without millers. Ovens that had baked bread stood without bakers. The people who had done the work of growing and processing and cooking and distributing food were gone, in numbers that varied by region, but that were in many places a third or more of the total population. The survivors faced the task of maintaining food production with fewer people. In some cases this meant that land went out of cultivation, reverting from arable use to grassland or scrub. In other cases it meant that the survivors worked harder to maintain production on the remaining cultivated land, doing the work of the dead as well as their own. The adjustments that were made varied by place and by the specific conditions of the local economy, and they worked out differently in different regions over the decades that followed. One consequence of the labour shortage was, as noted earlier, an improvement in the bargaining position of surviving labourers, which eventually expressed itself in better wages and in some cases in better access to land through the renegotiation of agricultural arrangements. The lords who owned the land on which peasant farmers worked, and who had previously been able to demand labour services and other obligations in exchange for access to land, found that their leverage was reduced when there were fewer people to work the land, and those who remained could choose among more options than had previously been available. The diet of ordinary people in England in the later part of the 14th century and into the 15th century gradually improved. More meat was eaten, as more pasture land replaced the arable that had been abandoned, and as the labour shortages made extensive arable farming less viable and animal husbandry relatively more attractive. The poorest people were somewhat less poor, at least in the decades after the initial devastation of the plague, and they ate somewhat more varied and somewhat more nourishing food. This improvement was not universal or permanent. The plague returned in further waves, each one reducing the population again and disrupting the patterns of recovery that had been established. And there were other pressures, fluctuations in harvest, economic changes, political disruptions, and the ordinary variability of life in a period when survival was not guaranteed for any but the most fortunate. But the overall trajectory of the diet of ordinary English people in the century after the Black Death was toward modest improvement, and this improvement was one of the unintended consequences of a catastrophe that had killed between a third and a half of the population. The food that people ate in the years and decades after the plague was not remarkable food. It was pottage and bread and ale and salted fish and occasional fresh meat and the produce of the garden. It was what it had always been, with modest variations. The recipes were not written down in most cases, as most of the people who made this food could not write, and the knowledge of how to make it was passed from one person to another, by example and by practice, and by the kind of knowledge that does not need to be written to be transmitted, because it is lived rather than read. The people who ate this food ate it in the ordinary way, at the table or on a bench, or standing in the field or in the inn or in the monastery. They ate with spoons made of bone or wood, and with their fingers when there was nothing requiring a spoon. They ate from bowls and from trenchers of stale bread, and from wooden plates and from the pot itself when there was no other vessel available. They ate in the morning and in the middle of the day and in the evening, at the times that the work of their day permitted, and when they had eaten, they went back to the work that remained, the feeding of animals and the maintenance of the hearth, and the management of the household and the raising of children, and the keeping of life in order, in the way that life in any period requires to be kept in order. They ate, and they continued. Part 13. The Cooking Fire. The fire was the centre of the medieval household. It was where food was cooked and where the household gathered for warmth, and it was maintained with the degree of attention and care that reflected how essential it was to the functioning of daily life. The fire in an ordinary household was not a fire in a closed stove or a fireplace with a chimney in the modern sense, though such things existed in grander houses. In the simplest homes it was an open fire on a central hearth, with the smoke rising through the room and escaping through a hole in the roof, or through gaps in the thatch, or through the general porousness of a structure that was not fully sealed against the outside. Managing this fire was a daily task. It was not allowed to go out entirely because relighting a fire was a laborious process in the absence of modern ignition tools. The coals and embers were banked each night, covered with ash to slow their consumption, and in the morning the ash was raked aside and the remaining live embers were fed with small pieces of dry wood until the fire was rebuilt. Dry wood was essential, as wet wood produced excessive smoke without reliable heat, and the storage of dry firewood was therefore a household priority, with wood being gathered and stacked in covered conditions to season and dry before use. Over the fire, the cooking pot was suspended from a hook or a chain attached to a beam above the hearth, or set directly on the coals or on a trivet of iron or stone that held it above the direct flame. The pot was typically made of iron or of pottery, and its size was matched to the size of the household. A large household had a large pot or multiple pots, and a small household had a small pot, and the pot was used for making pottage and for boiling water, and for any other preparation that required cooking in liquid. The management of the heat under the pot was a skill. There was no dial to turn and no precise control of temperature. The heat was adjusted by moving the pot closer to or further from the centre of the fire, by adding larger or smaller pieces of wood, by raising or lowering the pot on its chain if the chain permitted such adjustment. An experienced cook could manage these variables to achieve something close to a desired result, but the result was never as precisely controlled as modern cooking, and there was always an element of judgment and adaptation required. On the hearth beside the pot, bread might be baked in a clay pot with a lid, buried in the coals, or on a flat stone propped near the fire. Fish and meat might be roasted on a spit set before the fire, turned slowly to cook evenly on all sides. Flat cakes of oat or barley flour might be cooked on the griddle, a flat iron plate set over the fire, which was the simplest and oldest method of cooking grain foods. All of these methods required the fire, and the fire required constant attention, and the attention to the fire was woven into the daily routine of the household, as naturally as the attention to the animals and the attention to the children. During the plague, the fires in many houses went out. When everyone in a household fell ill at once, there was no one to tend the fire, and it dwindled and died, and the house grew cold, and the cooking stopped. Neighbours might keep a distance from a house known to be afflicted, and the afflicted themselves were often too weak to manage the basic tasks of maintaining the fire and preparing food. The survival of the ill depended partly on whether there was anyone in the household or community well enough to tend to them, to keep the fire going and the pot heated, and to bring water and food. This simple failure of the domestic fire multiplied across thousands of households in affected towns and villages, was one of the most practically significant consequences of the plague at the level of daily life. Not the grand historical narrative of population collapse and economic disruption, but the individual fire in the individual home that went out because there was no one left to tend it, and the pot that sat cold on the cold hearth, and the bread that was not baked that day. Part 14. The Market and the Fair. Food in the 14th century reached most people not through the modern mechanism of supermarkets and supply chains, but through markets, fairs, and the local production of individual households. Markets were regular events, held in towns on specific days of the week, at which produce from the surrounding agricultural area was brought for sale by the people who had produced it, and at which the inhabitants of the town could purchase what they needed. The market town was therefore an important node in the local food system, drawing in agricultural produce from a surrounding area of several miles radius and distributing it to the population of the town and to people who came from nearby villages specifically to buy and sell. The organization of markets was regulated. Traders were supposed to sell only in the market, not on the road before reaching it, and to use correct weights and measures, and to sell at fair prices. These regulations were enforced with varying degrees of effectiveness by local officials, and their violation was penalized by fines or, in more serious cases, by public punishment. At a typical market, one would find bread sold by bakers who were subject to the assize of bread, ale sold by alewives who were subject to the assize of ale, fresh vegetables and herbs sold by gardeners and farmers, meat sold by butchers who slaughtered animals and prepared them for sale, fish sold by fishmongers, some of whom dealt in fresh fish when available, and all of whom dealt in the preserved salt fish that was always available. Dairy products sold by dairymaids, butter, cheese, and sometimes fresh milk and cream, eggs sold by people who kept chickens and geese and ducks, grain and flour sold by farmers and millers. The fair was a larger event than the market, typically held once or twice a year and lasting for several days. Fairs attracted merchants from greater distances and traded in a wider range of goods, including the imported goods that did not appear at ordinary weekly markets: spices, fine cloth, wine, and various manufactured goods. The great fairs of medieval England, such as the fair at Boston in Lincolnshire and the fair at Winchester, were important commercial events that drew merchants from across England and from continental Europe, and they were occasions for the purchase of luxury foods and the specialized foodstuffs that could not be obtained locally. The disruption of markets and fairs by the plague was one of the significant economic consequences of the epidemic. When large numbers of people in a region were ill or had recently died, the market activity that normally organized the distribution of food was disrupted. Farmers who had produced to sell could not safely come to market, both because of fear of infection and because there were fewer people to manage the farm and the produce while they were away. Town residents who needed to buy food found that the usual supply was reduced. The prices of food at market, when markets continued to function at all, fluctuated in response to these disruptions in ways that further complicated the already difficult situation of people trying to feed themselves during the epidemic. In some towns, the market was formally suspended during the worst of the plague, on the grounds that gathering people together increased the spread of disease, a practical observation that anticipated germ theory by several centuries, though the theoretical framework through which it was understood was completely different. In other places, markets continued because the need for food was urgent and immediate, and the suspension of the market would have caused its own crisis. The tension between the risk of gathering people together and the need for the market to distribute food was managed differently in different places and was not resolved consistently by any overarching authority. Part 15. The Harvest. The harvest was the defining event of the agricultural year. All of the work of spring ploughing and planting and summer tending led to this culminating moment when the grain that had been growing through the long months was ready to be cut and gathered and stored, and the food supply of the coming year was determined by how much was brought in and how well it was preserved. The harvest required concentrated labour. The grain needed to be cut, which was done with a sickle or a scythe, the sickle being used for reaping close to the ground, and the scythe for cutting grain that stood relatively upright. The cut grain was gathered into bundles tied with straw, and stood in groups of several bundles leaned against each other to dry in the field before being carted to the barn. The whole process required many workers working for several days or weeks, depending on the size of the holding, and it was done with urgency, because grain left too long in the field after it was ripe would shed its grains or be damaged by rain, and either outcome reduced the quantity available for storage. In normal times, the harvest was a time of communal effort. Neighbours helped neighbours, and the labour was organised through local custom and obligation. At the end of the harvest, there was typically a feast, the harvest supper, at which those who had worked were fed by the farmer whose harvest had been brought in, with food and ale of somewhat better quality than was usually available. This feast was a social event as well as a reward for labour, a moment of celebration and communal gathering that marked the successful completion of the year's most important work. During the plague, harvests failed, not because the crops did not grow. The grain grew without regard for the epidemic affecting the population, but because there were insufficient people alive and well to bring it in at the right time. In the summer and autumn of 1349 in England, and in corresponding periods in other countries in the years when the plague first swept through, there are records of grain standing unharvested in fields as the weather turned and the season advanced, and of the grain eventually rotting or being consumed by birds and animals. The food that had been produced was lost because the people who would normally have harvested it were dead or ill or had fled. This failure of the harvest, coming on top of the direct mortality of the plague, was a compounding disaster. The deaths of a third or more of the population reduced the number of mouths that needed to be fed, which partially offset the reduction in food supply. But the disruption to the agricultural system was severe enough that the survivors faced food shortages in addition to the devastation of the disease itself. In subsequent years, as the surviving population adapted to the changed conditions, the harvest continued. Fewer fields were cultivated, as there were fewer people to cultivate them, and the focus shifted somewhat toward animal husbandry, which required less concentrated labour than arable farming. The grain that was grown was brought in by surviving harvesters, and the harvest supper was celebrated with fewer people around the table than had sat there before, in the company of absence, in the presence of the empty places where the dead had once sat and eaten and been part of the communal life of the village. The grain was stored in the granary. The granary was typically a separate building from the house, constructed to protect the stored grain from moisture and from the rats and mice that were inevitably attracted to stored food. The floors of granaries were sometimes raised on staddle stones, which were mushroom-shaped stone supports that held the floor of the granary above the ground, making it more difficult for rats to enter. The doors were kept shut and the structure was maintained to prevent the entry of the water. Grain stored properly in these conditions could last for a year or more, providing the household with the raw material for bread and ale until the next harvest. The amount of grain in the granary was watched with careful attention throughout the year. A household that ran out of grain before the next harvest faced a crisis, as there was no reliable way to purchase grain in the quantities needed for daily bread making at prices that the poor could afford. The management of grain reserves through the year was a constant calculation. How much bread to bake each day, how much to set aside for brewing ale, how much to keep as seed grain for the next planting, and whether the remaining supply would last until the harvest. Part 16. What the children ate. Children in the 14th century ate what their households produced or could afford, which was in most cases the same food that the adults ate, simply in smaller quantities. The modern notion of separate children's food was not a feature of the medieval diet, and children were expected to eat the same pottage and bread and salt fish that constituted the ordinary household diet, modified only by the quantities appropriate to their size and age. Very young children were breastfed, typically by their mothers, though in wealthy households the employment of a wet nurse was common, as breastfeeding was believed by some to prevent the resumption of fertility, and a wealthy woman who wished to have more children might choose to have her child nursed by another woman, so that her own fertility would return sooner. The duration of breastfeeding was variable, but children were typically nursed for 1 to 2 years, and the transition to solid food was gradual, beginning with very soft preparations such as pottage that had been cooked until very smooth, or bread soaked in liquid until soft, or the pap made from breadcrumbs mixed with milk or water that was used to supplement breast milk and eventually replace it. As children grew older, they ate more of the ordinary household diet. By the age of 5 or 6, a child would be eating pottage, bread, ale, and the other standard foods of the household in the quantities appropriate to their size. The ale given to children was often diluted with water, and in some households small ale, which was a weaker brew made from grain that had already been used once for brewing and therefore had less to give in a second brewing, was made specifically for children and for use as a general drink throughout the day. Children's food was not a major topic of discussion in the medical and dietary literature of the period, which was primarily concerned with the health and diet of adults, particularly adult men of the learned and wealthy classes for whom such literature was written. The dietary needs of children were addressed in passing in some texts, with recommendations that their food be moist and mild and easily digestible, consistent with the general theory that children's bodies were wetter and more delicate than adult bodies, and required food of appropriate qualities. The practical reality was that children ate what their households could provide, and the adjustments made for their age were matters of texture and quantity, rather than of separate or specially prepared foods. During the plague, children died in large numbers. The Black Death killed people of all ages, though its mortality rate varied somewhat by age, with certain groups, including young adults, appearing to have been particularly severely affected in some waves of the epidemic. Children who survived the disease faced a changed world, households depleted of adults, communities diminished, the normal structures of care and provision disrupted. Orphaned children were a significant social problem in the aftermath of the worst outbreaks, and the arrangements made for their care and feeding were managed differently in different communities, through extended family networks, through charitable institutions such as monasteries and hospitals, and through various informal arrangements that left few records. Part 17. The taste of the food. It is natural to wonder what the food described in this account actually tasted like. The ingredients are familiar enough: onions, barley, peas, bread, fish, ale. But the specific qualities of the food, as it was experienced by those who ate it, are difficult to recover fully. The cooking methods, the specific varieties of grain and vegetable and livestock used, the water, the salt, the fire, all of these contributed to flavours that were the result of a specific time and place and set of conditions that no longer exist. The bread was probably denser and more flavourful than most modern bread, particularly the bread made from mixed grains that contained a significant proportion of rye or barley. The leavening was likely less uniform than modern commercial yeast produces, and the crumb of the bread was probably somewhat uneven, with denser and airier patches. The crust would have been thick and hard from baking in a stone oven that produced dry heat, and the flavour would have been somewhat sour and nutty and complex, the result of grain that had been grown in soil without modern fertilisers and of fermentation that proceeded over longer times and at the variable temperatures of a pre-industrial environment. The pottage was almost certainly bland by modern standards. Without the array of seasonings that are now available and affordable, and with only small amounts of the spices that were so expensive, the flavour of an ordinary pottage was primarily the flavour of whatever grain or legume formed its base, with the additions of onion and whatever herbs were available providing the only interest. Salt was present, but in amounts that were not excessive, as salt too was a purchased commodity and not to be used without some consideration of its cost. The overall effect was a food that was filling and satisfying in the simple physical sense of providing warmth and fullness, but not exciting or memorable in terms of flavour. The ale was almost certainly different from any modern beer. Without hops, its bitterness was less pronounced, and its preservation less reliable. It was cloudy, alive with yeast, and its flavour was primarily malty, with a slight sourness from the fermentation and a yeasty undertone that was simply the characteristic taste of the drink. It was consumed fresh, within a few days of brewing, as it did not keep well, and a household that wanted ale had to brew regularly. The freshly brewed ale had a livelier, more yeasty flavour than ale that had stood for a few days, and people's preferences for fresher or older ale varied, as preferences for fermented beverages always vary. The saltfish was, by any account, extremely salty. The preservation required heavy salting, and even after soaking, the fish retained a pronounced saltiness that was a defining characteristic of the food. Combined with this was the flavour of the fish itself, which was not the fresh, mild flavour of freshly caught herring, but something more intense and complex, concentrated, slightly ripe, deeply savoury. People who ate salt fish regularly were accustomed to this flavour and did not find it unpleasant, but to a palate accustomed to fresh food and modest seasoning it would have been overwhelming. The vegetables from the garden were probably not very different in flavour from their modern equivalents, with the difference that they were grown without modern selective breeding and without the agricultural chemicals that have shaped the flavour of modern vegetables. Medieval onions and leeks and cabbages were the same species as their modern counterparts, cultivated over fewer generations of selection, and therefore perhaps somewhat more variable in flavour and size and appearance, but not so different as to be unrecognisable. The flavours of the 14th century table were, in summary, the flavours of simple, direct, largely unadorned food, grain and legume and root vegetable, preserved and cooked over wood fire, seasoned with salt and the herbs of the garden, washed down with cloudy ale. These flavours were the background taste of life, present at every meal, unremarkable in the same way that breathing is unremarkable, noticed only when they were absent. Part 18. The end of the meal. When the meal was finished, the bowls were cleared. If there were trenchers of bread, these were eaten or given away. The pot, if there was pottage remaining in it, was set aside, as leftover pottage could be reheated at the next meal, and a pot of pottage that was continually added to and reheated was a common practice in poorer households, a way of managing food across multiple meals and reducing waste. The practice was called by various names, and was described by observers with varying degrees of admiration and distaste, but it was entirely practical. A pot of pottage that was kept warm near the fire and added to with fresh ingredients each day was a continuously available source of hot food, and the accumulated flavours of many additions were perhaps not unpleasant. The bowls and spoons were washed or wiped clean, depending on the resources of the household. In a household with access to plentiful water and to the washing materials available, sand for scouring, perhaps some plant-based cleanser, the washing of vessels after meals was done with some thoroughness. In a household where water had to be carried from a distance, and where the time for washing up was limited by the demands of other work, the cleaning of vessels might be more perfunctory. The fire was attended to, the supply of wood checked, the animal pen visited if the household kept animals, the last tasks of the day done before the light failed and the household retired. Sleep came early in a world without artificial light, at least in the months when the days were short, and rose early for the same reason, and the period of sleep was long, and within it perhaps there was the particular deep and dreamless sleep of people who have worked hard with their bodies all day, and who are simply tired in the most fundamental sense. They slept, and in the morning they woke, and the fire was attended to, and the pottage was heated, and the bread was eaten, and the ale was poured, and the day began again, and the food was the same food, or nearly the same, as it had been the day before and would be the day after. This was what people ate during the Black Death. Not poison, not medicine, not anything remarkable. Just food. Just the ordinary, daily, unremarkable food of people who were alive and needed to eat, doing what people have always done and will always do, regardless of what else the world is doing around them. Part 19. The water was used in cooking even by people who did not drink it directly, because the brewing of ale and the making of bread and the preparation of pottage all required water, and the water used in cooking was in some sense made safer by the boiling and cooking that it underwent, even if this understanding was not articulated in modern terms by the people doing the cooking. The sources of water available to households varied by location. A house near a clean stream had access to running water of reasonable quality. A house in a town or village typically relied on a well, which drew water from the ground, and the quality of well water depended on the depth of the well, the nature of the soil and rock through which it passed, and the proximity of the well to sources of contamination, such as cesspits and animal pens, and the accumulated waste of a settled community. The well was a shared resource in most villages and small towns, and the maintenance of the well was a communal responsibility. The wooden mechanism of the well the windlass and bucket and rope, required regular maintenance, as the rope wore and the bucket deteriorated, and the windlass mechanism needed occasional repair. In a period when communal institutions were functioning normally, these maintenance tasks were accomplished through the normal channels of village life. The person responsible for the well was compensated or obligated by custom, the repair was done when needed, and the water supply was maintained. During the plague, well maintenance, like all other community maintenance tasks, was disrupted. In severely affected settlements, the very organisation that maintained shared resources collapsed when too many of the people involved in that organisation died or fled. Wells that needed repair went unrepaired. Water that was contaminated remained contaminated because there were insufficient people and insufficient will to address the problem. The connection between contaminated water and illness was not understood in a way that would have motivated remediation on those grounds, and the practical motivation of simple thirst was sometimes insufficient to overcome the difficulty of maintaining community infrastructure in the midst of epidemic. The water used in cooking was drawn in buckets or pots from the well or stream and carried to the house. The carrying of water was regular daily work, typically done by women and older children, and the amount carried depended on the needs of the day. More on brewing days, more on days when large quantities of food were being prepared, less on ordinary days when the main requirement was for the cooking pot and for drinking. A household without access to help in carrying water, because the people who normally did this work were ill or dead, faced an immediate and practical difficulty in maintaining the basic functions of cooking and housekeeping. Part 20. The cheese that kept. Of all the foods produced and consumed in the 14th century, hard-aged cheese was perhaps the most durable and the most reliably available throughout the year. A well-made hard cheese, properly salted and kept in a cool, dry place, could remain edible for months, and some varieties were aged for a year or more, developing in flavour and hardness as they sat in the dairy or the cellar. The making of cheese was a seasonal activity, as it depended on milk, and milk was most abundant in the late spring and summer when the grass was growing and the animals were in good condition. The cheese made in the spring and summer months was stored and consumed through the winter, so that the dairy's productive season in the warmer months provided food for the household through the colder months when fresh dairy was not available. This cycle of production and consumption was one of the fundamental rhythms of the agricultural year, as regular and as taken for granted as the cycle of planting and harvesting grain. The cheese cellar or dairy was a separate space, kept cool, where the cheeses rested on wooden shelves during their aging. The cheeses needed attention during this period. They were turned regularly so that they aged evenly, and the rind was rubbed or washed to control the mould that developed on the outside, encouraging the types of mould that were harmless or beneficial and discouraging those that were not. This management of the aging cheese was a skill that was passed from one generation to the next, and that required the kind of practical knowledge that is difficult to articulate, but is clear to those who have it. During the plague, the cheese that was in the cellar when the epidemic struck continued to age, as cheese does not stop aging because of human disasters. Where the household had been producing cheese and had a supply in the cellar, the surviving members, if any, had access to this food, even if they could no longer milk the animals or make new cheese. The cheese that had been made in the months before the plague arrived was, in a small way, a provision against disaster, though its makers had not known they were making it for that purpose. The flavour of aged cheese was, by the accounts of those who wrote about food in this period, valued for its strength and its saltiness and its capacity to make plain bread more interesting. A piece of hard cheese eaten with bread provided not only nourishment but something that might be called satisfaction, the sense of having eaten something with flavour and substance. In a diet that was otherwise rather uniform in its flavours, the cheese was a point of interest, something to look forward to, a regular small pleasure in a life that was not rich in pleasures. This was, in the end, what food was for. Not only for nourishment in the technical sense of providing calories and nutrients, but for the daily ordinary comfort of eating something familiar and adequate, of the pot being on the fire and the bread being baked and the ale being poured, of the meal coming at its regular time and providing the reliable punctuation of the day that a meal provides. Through the plague and after the plague, the cheese continued to age on its shelf, and the bread continued to be baked, and the pottage continued to simmer, and the ale continued to be brewed, and people continued to eat, one meal following another in the long and unremarkable succession of meals that constitutes the daily life of any human being in any period, notable only in retrospect if at all, and lived simply as the texture of days. This has been a history of what people ate during the Black Death. The bread was dense and dark, the pottage was thick and mild, the ale was cloudy and low in alcohol, the salt fish was very salty, the spices were expensive and warming, the garden grew onions and leeks and cabbages and peas, the cow was milked every morning, the pig was slaughtered in autumn, the monks observed their rule more or less, the fast days came and the feast days came and the plague came too, and moved through towns and villages and monasteries and castles, and people continued to eat what they had always eaten, in the ways they had always eaten it, because eating is one of the things that does not stop, not for any reason, not for any disaster, not for anything that has yet occurred in all the long and ordinary history of the world. Part 21. The soup that was not called soup. The word soup did not exist in the English language of the 14th century in the way it exists today. The word that came closest to it was essop, which referred to bread that had been soaked in liquid, and from which the later word soup derived, through a progression of linguistic change that was gradual and uneven, and which was not observed or recorded by the people through whose speech it passed. The food that would today be called soup was called pottage, or broth, or various other terms depending on its consistency and its ingredients, and its absence from the vocabulary as a distinct category did not mean that the food itself was absent. The food was present. Only the word was different. This distinction matters only slightly and perhaps not at all. The point is that people made liquid foods and ate them, and the specific word used to describe these foods was a feature of language, not of cooking, and the cooking went on regardless of the words used to describe it. A broth was thinner than a pottage. It was made by simmering meat or bones or both in water for an extended period, and the result was a clear or slightly cloudy liquid with the flavour of whatever had been cooked in it. This broth might be drunk on its own as a restorative preparation for the sick, which was one of its primary medicinal uses, or it might be poured over bread to make a sop, or it might be used as the cooking liquid for a more substantial pottage. The broth from simmered meat was valued both as food and as medicine, and the recommendation to give broth to sick people is one of the most consistent threads running through medieval medical advice about diet, a recommendation that anticipated modern understanding of the value of easily digestible, warm, nourishing liquids for those who are ill and cannot manage solid food. During the plague, the giving of broth to the ill was one of the forms of care that survivors could offer to those who were sick. If there was a pot on the fire and someone to tend it, and if there was meat or at least bones from which broth could be made, then the sick person could be given something warm and nourishing that did not require chewing or significant effort to swallow. The act of making broth for the sick, and the act of bringing it to them and persuading them to drink it, was one of the small human acts of care that continued through the epidemic, one person trying to help another with the only tools available, warmth, liquid, and the soluble nutrients that hours of simmering coaxed out of bones. Whether the broth helped is a question that cannot be answered simply. It provided calories and warmth and some nutrients, and it prevented dehydration, which was a significant cause of deterioration in plague patients, as in patients with any severe illness. It did not address the underlying infection, which no medicine of the period could address, but it may have helped some patients remain stronger for longer, and it certainly did no harm, and the making and giving of it was an act of care that had meaning beyond its direct physical effects. The broth simmered, the fire was tended, the sick person drank or did not drink. The day passed as days do, slowly and then all at once, and the night came and the fire was banked and the morning came again with its grey light and its requirement that the fire be rebuilt and the pot be set back on and the food be prepared for another day. Part 22. The ordinary conclusion. There is no dramatic conclusion to a history of what people ate during the Black Death. The food did not save them, and it did not kill them, or at least not in most cases. It was simply the constant background of daily life, present through the catastrophe as it was present before and after, doing what food always does, sustaining the body, marking the passage of time, providing the punctuation of the day, being prepared and consumed and prepared again in the endless repetition that is the most ordinary feature of human existence. The grain grew in the fields and was harvested, and was ground at the mill, and was made into bread and eaten. The pot was set on the fire, and the water was poured in, and the vegetables were chopped, and the peas were added, and the pottage simmered and was eaten. The ale was brewed and poured into cups and drunk. The fish was salted and soaked and cooked and eaten on fast days. The pig was slaughtered in autumn, and its parts were salted and smoked and eaten through the winter. The cow was milked, and the butter was churned, and the cheese was made and aged and eaten. The herbs were cut from the garden and added to the pot, and their flavours dispersed through the cooking liquid, and were tasted in the finished food without being distinctly noticed. All of this happened during the Black Death. It happened before it and after it, and in the intervals between the waves of the epidemic that continued to recur through the second half of the 14th century and into the 15th, each wave finding a new generation of people with no immunity to the disease, each wave reducing the population again and disrupting the patterns of recovery that had been established, and through all of it, The food continued, because it had to, because hunger does not stop for plague, any more than plague stops for hunger, because the body requires what the body requires every day, without exception, and the provision of those requirements is the most basic and most relentless task of any human life. The fire was lit, the pot was set on, the morning began. End. A boring history for sleep. What people ate during the Black Death. The grain was grown and milled and baked and eaten. The ale was brewed from barley malt and drunk by everyone from children to the elderly. The salt fish was soaked overnight and cooked on the days when meat was forbidden. The pottage simmered on the fire from early morning until midday, and was eaten from wooden bowls with wooden spoons or with torn bread, and the bowls were wiped clean or washed in cold water and put away on the shelf, and the next day the same pottage was heated again, and the day after that another pottage was started, and this cycle continued through spring and summer and autumn and winter, and back to spring again, as it always had and as it always would, the most ordinary and necessary and unremarkable thing in the world. People eating food day after day in the middle of history, in the middle of catastrophe, in the middle of the long undramatic passage of time that constitutes most of what has ever happened to most of the people who have ever lived. The fire burned low at night and was rebuilt in the morning. The pot was set on its chain, and the pottage boiled. The bread rose in the warmth of the hearth, or did not rise very much, and was baked and eaten either way. The cheese sat on its shelf in the cool cellar and aged quietly. The ale in the barrel settled and cleared, and that was enough. That was in the end what there was, and it was enough, as it had always been enough, as it would continue to be enough. The food of ordinary days passing through the hands of ordinary people and becoming simply life. There is nothing more to say about it than that. There never was. The pot was on the fire, the bread was in the oven. The day was beginning, as days always began, quietly and without ceremony, in the 14th century as in every other century, the morning arriving with its requirements and its ordinariness, and the people rising to meet it with their hunger and their hands and their long familiarity with the work of keeping themselves alive and fed, one meal at a time, one day at a time, through everything, through the plague and after it, through the winter and into the spring, through the long and largely uneventful succession of ordinary days that, taken together, made up the whole of their lives and the whole of this history which is now concluded. Part 23. The pot and its contents. The cooking pot of the 14th century was a fundamental object. It was not a beautiful object in most cases. It was a functional object, made of iron or of pottery, thick-walled and heavy, designed to withstand the repeated heating and cooling of regular use over a fire, and to contain whatever liquid and solid ingredients were placed in it, without cracking or warping or otherwise failing in its purpose. The iron pot was the more durable and the more expensive. A good iron pot represented a significant investment for a household of modest means, and it was maintained with care and repaired when possible rather than discarded when damaged. The iron pot was seasoned over time by use. The coating of carbonized fat and cooking residue that built up on its interior surface improved its non-stick properties and protected the iron from rusting when in contact with acidic foods. A well-used iron pot had a dark, almost black interior surface
that was the result of many hundreds of meals, and that was considered a sign of a properly maintained and much used cooking vessel. The pottery pot was cheaper and more fragile. It was made from local clay, fired in a kiln, and it came in various sizes and qualities depending on the skill of the potter and the quality of the clay. A good pottery pot could be used over a fire for years without cracking, but a poor one might crack with the first or second heating, and the difference between a good pot and a poor one was not always apparent before use. Pottery pots were therefore purchased with some caution, and a potter who made consistently good cooking pots had a reputation that was worth maintaining. Into this pot went the ingredients of the day's pottage. Water was the first thing, drawn from the well or the stream and poured in sufficient quantity to cover whatever was to be cooked and to allow for the evaporation that occurred during the long cooking. Then the grain or the dried legumes, if these were being used, the peas or the beans that had been soaking since the previous evening, now somewhat softened and ready for the long cooking that would make them fully tender. Then the vegetables, the onions, roughly chopped, the leeks cut into rings, the turnips or parsnips cut into pieces of roughly equal size, the cabbage torn or cut into manageable portions. If meat was available, and if the day was not a fast day, a piece of salt pork or a bone with some meat attached went in as well. The salt pork would need to have been soaked to remove some of its salt, otherwise it would make the entire pottage unpleasantly salty, and the soaking was done in cold water for some hours, with the water changed once or twice if the piece was very heavily salted. The bone, if it was a fresh bone rather than a salted one, went in directly. The purpose of the bone was partly the small amount of meat that might be on it, and partly the gelatin and minerals that simmered out of it into the cooking liquid over long hours, enriching the liquid and giving it a body and depth of flavour that plain water lacked. Then the herbs, a bunch of parsley tied together, sprigs of thyme, a few sage leaves, perhaps some savoury or marjoram, whatever was available in the garden or had been dried from the previous summer's growth. These went in early to give their flavours time to disperse through the cooking liquid. Later, toward the end of cooking, fresh herbs might be added for a brighter, more immediate flavour, but this was a refinement that not everyone employed, and that depended on the availability of fresh herbs at the time of cooking. The pot was then set over the fire and left to come to a simmer. Bringing a large pot of cold water and ingredients to a simmer over an open fire took some time, and the cook would tend the fire during this period, adding wood to build up sufficient heat, and would watch the pot until the first small bubbles began to appear at the surface. Then the fire could be reduced somewhat, the larger pieces of wood replaced with smaller ones that would maintain a steady, moderate heat, without the intense burning that was needed to bring the pot to temperature. The pottage then cooked. It cooked for an hour, or 2 hours, or 3, or more, depending on what was in it and when it was needed. Dried peas required the longest cooking, sometimes 4 or 5 hours before they were fully soft, and a pottage started in the early morning might not be ready until midday. Fresh vegetables cooked more quickly. Grain, if it had been soaked, cooked in perhaps an hour. The cooking time was judged not by a clock, since clocks were rare and imprecise and not present in ordinary households, but by the appearance and the smell and the taste of the contents. A cook who had been making pottage for years knew when it was done without needing to measure the time. During the cooking, the pot required occasional attention.
a stir with a long wooden spoon to prevent the contents from sticking to the bottom, a check on the fire to ensure the heat was maintained, a taste to assess the salt and the seasoning, perhaps the addition of a small amount more water if the liquid had reduced too much. These attentions were not demanding and did not require the cook to remain beside the pot continuously. The pottage could be left to cook while other work was done in and around the house, and the smell of it cooking was a reliable indicator of its progress. The raw smell of uncooked grain and vegetables giving way over the hours to the cooked, savoury smell of a finished pottage. When the pottage was done, it was thick, or at least thicker than it had been at the start, the starch from the grain and the peas having thickened the cooking liquid, and the vegetables having softened and broken down somewhat into the surrounding broth. The colour was a dull brownish grey or greenish grey, depending on the vegetables used, with perhaps some orange from carrot or parsnip and some darker patches from the cooked meat if any was present. It was not a visually exciting preparation. It was pottage. It was served into bowls or onto trenchers of bread, and it was eaten with spoons and with bread for scooping, and the eating of it was not a prolonged or ceremonious event. The household ate when the pottage was ready, sitting at the table or on benches arranged around the hearth, and the eating was done with the practical efficiency of people who had work to return to when the meal was finished. Conversation during meals existed and was not prohibited, but it was not required, and many meals were eaten in a silence that was comfortable rather than awkward. The silence of people who had nothing particular to say to each other that had not already been said during the course of the morning. Part 24. The bread that was made on Tuesday. There was no specific reason why the bread of this particular household was made on Tuesday, rather than on some other day. It was simply the day that had been settled into by habit, the day when the oven was fired and the dough was prepared and the bread was baked. Other households might bake on different days, and in a village with a communal oven the day of baking might be determined by a rotation of use rather than individual preference, each household having its assigned time in the oven's weekly cycle. The preparation for bread making began the evening before. The flour, which had been obtained from the miller and stored in a wooden bin or a sack in a dry part of the house, was measured out into a large wooden bowl or a wooden trough. The quantity of flour depended on how much bread the household needed. A large household needed more, a small one less, and the amount was judged from experience rather than measured with any particular precision. A household accustomed to baking knew roughly what quantity of flour was needed to produce a week's supply of bread, and this amount was what was measured out. To the flour was added a quantity of the yeast that had been saved from the previous week's baking, or from the fermentation of ale, or that had been obtained from a neighbour if the household's own supply had been used up or had gone bad. The yeast was mixed with a small amount of warm water and left for a short time to activate before being combined with the rest of the flour and the remaining water. This activation of the yeast was understood in practice. The yeast needed to be living and active to make the bread rise, though not in the modern scientific sense of understanding what yeast is and how it functions. The water was added gradually, the dough being worked as it was added to ensure even distribution. The working of bread dough required physical effort. The dough was pressed and folded and turned repeatedly. The weight of the hands and forearms used to develop the gluten structure that would give the finished bread its texture. This work was done on a floured surface, and it continued until the dough had a smooth, elastic consistency that indicated sufficient working. The duration of this kneading was not precisely timed, but was judged by the feel of the dough, which changed as the gluten developed from a rough, sticky mass into something smoother and more cohesive. The dough was then shaped into a round or oblong mass and covered with a cloth, and left in a warm place near the hearth to rise. Rising was the work of the yeast, which consumed sugars in the flour and produced carbon dioxide gas that formed small bubbles throughout the dough and caused it to expand. A well-risen dough approximately doubled in size, the surface becoming slightly puffy and the interior light with the accumulated gas. This rising took several hours, and in cold weather it took longer, which was one of the practical disadvantages of bread making in winter. While the dough was rising, the oven was heated. In a household with its own oven, wood was placed inside and set alight, and the fire burned inside the sealed oven until the oven walls and floor had absorbed sufficient heat. The test for whether the oven was sufficiently heated was done by throwing a small amount of flour on the oven floor. If it browned quickly, the oven was ready. If it took too long or did not brown at all, more heating was needed. This method was imprecise but practical, and an experienced baker could judge the oven temperature reliably by this and other methods. Once the oven was heated, the remaining burning wood was raked out and the oven floor swept clean of ash. The risen dough was then formed into the final shape of the loaves, round or oblong, scored on top with a knife to allow for controlled expansion during baking, and loaded into the oven on a long flat paddle called a peel. The oven was then sealed, and the bread baked in the declining heat. The baking of bread in a declining heat meant that the temperature was highest at the beginning and gradually fell as the baking proceeded. This was not ideal from the perspective of precise baking control, but was simply the nature of the technology available. Experienced bakers managed the process by knowing how long the bread needed in the oven, and by opening the oven periodically to check progress, tapping the bottom of a loaf to hear whether it sounded hollow, which indicated that it was cooked through. The finished bread came out of the oven hot and fragrant, its crust a dark brown, sometimes darkening toward black on the bottom, where it had been in closest contact with the hot oven floor. It was left to cool on a wooden rack or a flat surface before cutting, because cutting hot bread caused it to collapse somewhat and produced a doughy, compressed crumb rather than the open crumb of properly cooled bread. The wait for the bread to cool was a familiar exercise in mild impatience, the smell of fresh bread being one of the more compelling smells available to a household. When cool, the bread was stored in a cloth or a basket in a dry place. It would remain good for several days before becoming stale, and the stale bread was used for trenchers or soaked in liquid to soften it, or added to pottage to thicken it. Very little of the bread was wasted, because bread was valuable, and waste of it was understood as a failure of good household management. All of this, from the measuring of the flour on Monday evening to the eating of the last of the stale bread the following Monday, before the new baking, was the bread week of a 14th century household. It was a cycle that repeated without particular variation week after week and year after year, in households throughout England and throughout Europe, in years of plenty and years of shortage, before the plague and during it and after it,
the bread being made on its appointed day with the regularity of something that cannot reasonably stop. Part 25. The cellar. Beneath some houses, and beneath the kitchens of larger establishments, there was a cellar. The cellar was a cool, dark, relatively stable space that was used for storing food and drink that benefited from cool storage: wine, ale, hard cheese, salted meats, root vegetables in autumn and winter, and various other provisions. The temperature underground was lower and more constant than above ground, which slowed the spoilage of perishable foods and kept stored items in better condition for longer. The cellar of a modest household was not a large space. It might be a single room of perhaps 10 by 12 feet, with a low ceiling and an earthen floor that remained damp and cool throughout the year. The walls were of stone or brick or beaten earth, depending on the construction of the house, and they were cool in all weather, which was their primary virtue. Access was through a heavy wooden door set in the floor or in the wall, approached by a short flight of stone steps or a wooden ladder depending on the configuration. In this cellar, the ale barrel sat on its wooden trestle. A barrel of ale was a heavy object when full, too heavy to move easily, and so it was manoeuvred into position when empty and filled in place, and the ale was drawn from it through a wooden tap fitted into the end of the barrel. The tap was a simple device, a wooden plug with a hole through it that could be opened to allow ale to flow into a jug held beneath and closed to stop the flow. Managing the tap required a degree of care, as a poorly fitted tap or a tap that was not fully closed would allow ale to drip continuously and waste it. Beside the ale barrel, or in a separate section of the cellar, the wine might be stored if the household had wine. Wine was a more precious commodity than ale and was stored with correspondingly more care. Wine that had gone bad, turning to vinegar, was not wasted but used for cooking and for the various preserving and cleaning purposes for which vinegar was employed. The cheeses on their shelves occupied one area of the cellar. The salted meats in their barrels occupied another. The root vegetables in their bins or piled on the floor occupied a third. The management of these stores through the winter was a matter of regular attention. Checking the cheeses for excessive mould, turning the barrels of salted meat to ensure even distribution of the brine, removing any vegetables that had begun to rot before the rot spread to neighbouring ones. During the plague period, the cellar continued its function. The ale in the barrel did not know that the plague was in progress. The cheese on the shelf aged at the same pace it had always aged. The salted meat in its brine continued to preserve as it had always preserved. Where households were entirely emptied by the plague, their cellars continued to hold their stores for some time, undisturbed, until eventually someone came and found them. The cheese still on its shelf, the ale still in the barrel, the salted meat still in its brine, waiting for people who would not return to eat them. Part 26. The long afternoons of winter. In winter, when the days were short and the work that could be done outdoors was limited, the household gathered around the fire in the long afternoons, and the preparation of food was one of the main activities of these hours. Grain was sorted and cleaned. Dried peas and beans were sorted, picking out any that were damaged or infested, or simply too old to be worth cooking. And food was prepared in the slow, repetitive way of winter afternoons. The shelling of dried legumes, the peeling of root vegetables, the scraping of bones to get the last of the meat,
the careful management of the fire and the pot, filling the hours in a way that was not precisely pleasant and not precisely unpleasant, but simply necessary, and therefore done without particular complaint. The smell of these winter hours was the smell of the fire, wood smoke, and through the smoke the smell of whatever was in the pot, and the particular smell of a closed house in winter where people were all inside together and the ventilation was minimal. This smell was the smell of warmth and of human habitation, and though it would strike a modern nose as heavy and somewhat unpleasant, it was to those who lived in it simply the smell of home, familiar and unremarkable. In these winter hours, the day's food was assessed in the practical way of someone who needs to feed a household from what is available, and who has done this many enough times that the assessment requires no great thought. The pottage was on the fire. The bread from Tuesday was 2 days old and still edible, though becoming stale. There was cheese, there was ale. The meal that would be eaten in the late afternoon when the light began to fail was already determined by what was available and what had been prepared. It was not an interesting meal. It was the meal that was there, made from what was on hand, eaten in the company of the household in the warmth of the fire, and when it was finished the bowls were cleared and the fire was made up for the evening, and the night's rest began. And the following morning the assessment of the stores was made again, and the pot was set on again, and another day's food was determined by the same quiet calculation. This was winter. This was the long season of short days and indoor work, and the slow consumption of what had been stored. And in the spring the stores would be running low, and the first green things would be appearing in the garden, and the chickens would be laying again, and the world would open up again, and the cycle that had always turned would turn again, and the food would change with the season. In the small ways it always changed, and the household would eat what the season provided. The pot would be on the fire, the bread would be made, the ale would be poured. This was what people ate during the Black Death, before it and during it and after it. The unremarkable, daily, essential business of eating, continuing through everything, as it always has and as it always will, quiet and necessary and entirely without drama. The most ordinary thing in the world,